In the previous video, I showed you how to use view models with Hilt, how to inject things through the constructor into the view model using Hilt, also how to create a view model instance that exists only in a specific fragment. If you rotate, that instance still exists. Also how to share a view model between multiple fragments. So how to essentially, share a view model to or host a view model in an activity which can be shared across multiple fragments in that activity. So I showed you all that, and now we're ready to build out the dependencies, the real things that are going to be injected into the view model. So let's take a quick look at a diagram. So currently our business logic consists of something that kind of looks like this. We have our retrofit service at the very end, which gets data from the network. The repository gets that retrofit service as a constructor argument, so that's how it gets its data. And then you have the view model at the end here. The view model is going to take the repository as a constructor argument. So we need to kind of set up this sort of system. So basically declare the retrofit instance as a dependency, and then do constructor injection, inject it into the repository, and then do constructor injection one more time and inject the repository into the view model. So remember one video ago, I was reminding you about this Android entry point annotation, which is used for fragments, used for activities to tell Hilt that we're injecting things into those classes. Also, we have this other special one for the view model, this view model inject annotation, telling Hilt that we're doing constructor injection into this view model. We're going to be injecting things into it. So now we are going to look at the third type of annotation for creating dependencies, and that's what we're going to use to build out our repository as a dependency, build out the retrofit service as a dependency, that kind of stuff. So there's two ways you can do this. Basically, we're talking about declaring dependencies that are not fragments, not activities, not view models, basically everything else. There's two ways to do this. Number one is how I've shown you before, how we've done it in the app module. You have a singleton or whatever scope you want. You use the provides annotation. Also, there's the binds annotation, which I didn't talk about and I'm not going to talk about. So you can look into that if you want to, and just kind of building out these dependencies. So that's the first way. And let's go over that way, and then I'm going to show you the second way. So right click on DI, go to new Kotlin file, and create a file named network module. Now inside network module, this will be a singleton like our other modules. We need the @module annotation to tell Hilt that this is a module and we're going to be declaring dependencies into it. Now we need to declare the component that these dependencies are going to exist inside of. So I'm going to give you lots of room here to give you a better view, and I will also close this to give you still a better view. So the first way here is the way that you already know. I go @singleton, @provides, and then write some function to provide some dependency. So I'm going to write fun provide recipe mapper and do recipe mapper. This is the recipe DTO mapper, so the one for mapping the network DTO objects to domain models or domain models to recipe DTO models. Now just return the recipe DTO mapper. Now this is declared as a dependency, and I could inject this into things. So that means I could go into my view model, for example, and I could write, private value recipe DTO mapper, and I could inject that into the view model. That would be no problem. I could also do field injection in the fragment if I wanted to. If I wanted to go inside of the fragment here, I could do @inject, late init variable. I'll just say mapper, do recipe DTO mapper, and that would be perfectly fine. So I could inject both of those things, no problem. Now I'm going to press undo to undo the things that I just did, because that's not what we actually want to do. I don't want to inject this into the view model, so I can also delete that, delete the import, and now let's go back to our network module. Now the network module, the DTO mapper is actually a dependency in the repository. So if you go to the repository, open up our repository implementation, this is a dependency for this class. So right here, it takes it as a constructor argument. Also, it takes the recipe service. So these are the two things that we need to inject into the repository. So those are the dependencies that we're going to build. So we have one of them. We have the recipe mapper. Now we need to build the retrofit service. So let me copy the singleton and provides, paste that down below, and now do fun provide recipe service. And this will take no arguments, and it will return a recipe service. Now, I did this, I believe, when I originally set up the network stuff. I did it as an example, so you guys might be familiar with this. Also, if you use Retrofit, you're definitely going to be familiar with this. This is essentially now just the basic kind of setup for Retrofit. So I need the base URL, food2fork.ca/API/recipe, and we need a trailing slash there. That's very important. And then I want to add a converter factory. So JSON converter factory called .create, and inside of create called JSON JSON builder, and initialize that object. And then do .create, and then there's our converter factory for converting or serializing our objects that we get from the network. Then call it .build and convert it into a recipe service. So this build function will return a retrofit object. Now we want to build the recipe service. So we call .create, do recipe service class.java. And there's our recipe service. So now this recipe service we have declared as a top level object that's going to exist as long as the application is alive, because it's a singleton and it's installed into the application component. So I never have to build this object again. I can just inject it into the things that I need. So that's kind of a beautiful thing. It's a very easy way to create objects, reuse objects, never have to build them again. So now we need to build the repository as a dependency. So let's create another module. I'm going to go into DI, create another Kotlin file, and call this repository module, and go object. So it's a singleton repository module. Open this up, at module, because we need to tell Hilt that this is a module. At install in, like we've done before. Again, we're going to use the application component. And now what do we want to put in here? Well, I'll close this to give you some more room. I keep forgetting to do that. Now we want to do the same kind of thing. So at singleton, at provides, you should be getting very good at this by now. Now provide recipe repository, and this will actually take some constructor arguments. So I'll come back to that, but this is going to return a recipe repository. Open this up, and now we want to instantiate the implementation. So recipe repository implementation, and open this up because this does take some constructor arguments. So if you look here, it says we need the recipe service and the recipe DTO mapper. So how do we get those things? How do we get those things into our implementation here? Well, we can actually pass them as constructor arguments here, and Hilt will know where to put them. So I can just say, recipe service, I can say recipe mapper, there's our DTO mapper, and now I can pass these as constructor arguments. So recipe service and recipe DTO mapper. I can actually make this all on one line. So this probably looks like hocus pocus. It looks like magic. How does Hilt know how to do this? So this is one of the features of using Dagger, of using dependency injection. When you build this thing called the dependency graph, what you're doing is you're declaring dependencies like I've done here. These things are just going to exist inside of the dependency graph. And whenever you declare other dependencies that require the other dependencies, that sound kind of confusing, but like we have the repository here, the repository requires a recipe service and a recipe DTO mapper. We can just pass them as constructor arguments to the function, or pass them as arguments to the function. And Hilt will be smart enough to know, okay, this is a recipe service. Where do I get that? Well, look, I have a recipe service right here. I'll just use that one. And then it'll say, recipe DTO mapper. Where do I get one of those things? And it'll say, oh, I got one right here, and I'll just inject that. So Hilt is smart enough to do that for us. And now we have this recipe repository that I can inject into the view model. So I can go to the view model. I'll delete this random string, or actually I'll leave that random string because I want to show you something else later. So private value, I'll say repository, and then just inject that recipe repository. Now I'm sure you have a lot of questions. So I'm going to guess what your questions are right now, and you can follow along if those are actually things you're confused about. So one of your first questions is, you're probably wondering, why am I injecting a recipe repository when, if you look at the dependency that I'm declaring here, this returns a recipe repository implementation. So I bet you that is something you're confused about. The next thing you're probably confused about, or maybe you forgot, is originally I said that this is the first method of declaring dependencies, and there's actually a secondary method that you could use. So you might have forgot about that, but you might have remembered. So I just want to remind you that, don't worry, I'm going to come back to that. I'm still going to show you that second method. This is just the first method. So you create a module, you annotate it with a scope, you use add provides, and you return that object. That's method number one for adding something to the dependency graph. But don't worry, again, I'm going to come back to that. So first, let's talk about this recipe repository and this recipe repository implementation. How can I return a different object here but inject, the interface? This might seem a little weird to you. This is a pretty common thing to do with dependency injection. You can see here I'm returning the interface. I'm specifying a type of the interface, but then I'm returning the implementation. This is a common pattern with dependency injection, and it's one of the things that makes testing easier. So the reason you do this is because when you're building out your tests, which we're going to be doing this in the course after this one, we're going to be building out those tests. When you build out the tests, you might often run into a scenario where you want to build what's called a test fake. So this is a great example with the network, because in a test, you can't actually access the network. It's just a test, especially if it's a unit test. If it's a unit test, it doesn't even know anything about the Android framework. So you definitely want to build like some kind of a test fake that is not real, because it can't actually access the network. So by returning the implement or the interface, or specifying a type of the interface, then returning the implementation, it makes it really easy to build out fakes and then return those fakes instead. So for example, I could use the same module here, but instead of returning that repository implementation, I could return another class that I could call, I don't know, repository fake. I would do the exact same thing, but that repository fake would use a fake service instead of the real retrofit service. So I'm sure you're confused about this, and there's really no way to like condense this explanation any further. So I think if you're confused about that, just wait till you get to the testing kind of stuff, which will be in the next course. Then that stuff will make sense. So now let's talk about the second method that I was talking about for declaring these dependencies. So right now we have the method where you have the singleton annotation, or whatever scope you want to use. You use @provides, and you build a function to build out that dependency. So what is this secondary way that I've been talking about? So what could we have done alternatively? So say I wanted to use the other method of providing a dependency for this repository. So I'll just, comment this out. So I'll comment that out. It's not doing anything anymore. So how could I alternatively build out this dependency and add it to our dependency graph? Well, you could go into the recipe repository implementation. You could add an @inject annotation and add a constructor. And I'll tab all this in to make it look a little better. And then there you go. That would do exactly the same thing, other than I would want to add a singleton scope to the top of this. So this sort of pattern here, by adding @inject, adding a constructor, adding the scope, that is identical to doing this right here. Absolutely identical. It will do the exact same thing. I can still inject my repository into my view model. It's still going to get built as a dependency, literally exactly the same. So that is method number 2. Method number 1 would be using @provides, singleton, adding it to a module. Wait, I think I said method number 2. I meant method number 1. Method number 1 is creating the singleton, provides. Well, actually, the singleton doesn't matter. It's the same in both cases, but basically using provides, providing it in the module. The secondary method is adding the inject annotation to the constructor. You can add the scope, and then there you go. So I'm going to go with method number 1. So I'm going to delete this and just kind of bring that back up there, get rid of the singleton annotation. The reason I'm going to go with method number 1 is generally I prefer method number 1 because it's more clear what is a dependency and what isn't. If you can think of a large code base, if you had a whole bunch of these classes laying around and some of them were dependencies, some of them weren't, some of them had inject, some of them didn't, some of them were declared in the module, I think that could get pretty confusing. If a developer was not familiar with the code base, they would be looking all over the place, for dependencies. Where are they declared? Where is this inject annotation? Where is it not? I just think it's more clean, I think, to just put it in the module. Also, when it comes to building out the fakes for the tests, it's easy to just swap out a module and then you just provide the other dependency, as opposed to having the inject, and that way it's not as sort of streamlined to swap out the module or swap out the dependency. So that's my preferred way. You can do what you want. Again, I think really what it comes down to is when it comes to testing, it's easier to just swap out that module for a fake dependency. Now, one last thing that I want to show you has to do with the token. So if we go into our recipe service, for example, so if I click here, remember we have this authorization token that needs to get passed as a header to each one of our requests. So we need this in our view model to be able to do the request. So just as a practical example, we need this in here because just for example, if I was to go like repository, search, One of the arguments here is the token. So I need that token in the view model to be able to do anything. So ideally, what I want is I want to be able to do private value token, and I want to have the token right here. So how would I go about doing that? Also, this brings up a question. How does Hilt know to inject, the token for this string, but the random string for that string? How does it know if you inject the same type as a constructor argument? Is there some kind of a mechanism for that? And the answer is yes. So I'm going to show you that also. So let's suppose that we're injecting the random string, even though I know we don't need it. But we're also injecting the token. They're of the same type, so Hilt is theoretically probably going to be a little bit confused. So let's go into, let me just clean this stuff up. We don't need a lot of this. Let's go into the network module, and down at the bottom, let's first declare another dependency. This will be a singleton also. This will be for the token. So fun provide, we'll call it auth token. It'll take nothing. It's going to return a string, and it's just going to return a token. And I can't remember what that token is. So to get the token, go to food2fork.ca, just scroll down, and boom, there is the token. It's all in the documentation, the beautiful documentation that I built for you. So there's that token, and now we have that declared as a dependency. But now the question comes, how do we know? How does it know this is the random string? How does it know this is the token? Well, there's this nice little annotation that we can use called @named, and we can specify a name. So I can do @named auth_token. Now I can copy this annotation, go into my view model, and just do private @named, specify the name, and then now Hilt knows that, okay, we have two strings here, but this one has a special name, so then it knows, okay, I can just look at this name, and that will work just fine. So now just to test that everything's working, let's print all this stuff to the log. Let's print the repository, let's print the token, and I don't know, was there anything else that we needed to see? I think that was pretty much it. If that works, then I think it means that everything's working. I guess as another test, we could also print it in the activity. So I could do fun, I don't know, get repo and just return the repository. I could do fun, get random string and return that random string, and then maybe fun token or get token equals that token. So then I can go into our fragment. So let's go into, I'll copy this stuff actually. Now I'll go into our fragment, so recipe list fragment, and I'll just copy this 2 more times. So the view model, let's do .get repo. We'll do view model .get random string and view model .get token. So now when we run the app, what we expect to see is, well, maybe I should change this. This should be like fragment. That way it's different in the log. So when we run the app, we should see that the view model prints out this stuff, and then also the fragment will have a reference to that stuff. So let's run the app and see if all of this works. Okay, so that's a good sign. We have our app running on the screen here, so that's good. If the app runs, that's actually a really good sign when you're using dependency injection, because if there was some kind of a conflict, it would have given you an error by now. So now I'm going to copy this fragment text, and let's take a look. So there's the repository, great. There's our random string, great. And then there's the token. Now let's switch this to a view model, and we should see the exact same thing. Yep, so there's the string. It's in a different order, but that's fine. There's the repository, and then there is the token. So at this point, we have our dependencies all set up, and I can get rid of this random string now. It's no longer needed. Let me just get rid of that, get rid of the random string. That was just for demonstration purposes. So I'm going to go into the app module, and I'll also just delete that random string because it is no longer needed. So at this point, we have our main sort of backend architecture all set up. We have the retrofit service, which is passed as a constructor argument to the repository. We have our repository, which is passed as a constructor argument to the view model. And now we're ready to start on the next part of the course, which is actually, getting the data, displaying the data, that kind of stuff. Now, one last thing before we go and we move on to the next part of the course, which is like the UI part, the part where we actually get to, see all of our hard work that we put into our architecture, all the dividends actually pay off. One last thing before you go is, if you didn't know, I do this for a living. I create courses, I create content, I build these nice courses. This is a free course. This is 100% free, and it took me quite a while to build. It takes me quite a while to film these, edit these, publish these, build those damn thumbnails. Those actually take a long time. If you could just take 2 minutes out of your day, it would really help me out. Head on over to codingwithmitch.com, create an account. It's totally free. So if you want to create an account, just go over here to log in. You can click down here on register, create an account. It's totally free. You just need your email, username, password, and make sure to click subscribe to the newsletter, because if you subscribe to the newsletter, you're going to get notified when all of my other courses get created. Once you've created an account, please go down to more up here, the more section, go to testimonials and leave me a testimonial. As I said, I do this full time, so these testimonials are really meaningful to me. So it takes, no time at all. Just write a testimonial, click here, tell me specifically how I helped you. Maybe I helped you get a job. So Mitch helped me get a job, or get a job. Or maybe Mitch helped me advance to a senior level. Mitch helped me get promoted. Any of these things, leave me a testimonial, leave me something good, give me a rating. Of course, you're going to leave me a 5-star rating, and then click submit. That would be very, very helpful if you could take the time to do that. And of course, no video would be complete without leaving some engagement. So go down there, leave some engagement, leave a like. Thanks a lot. I'll see you in the next video for the UI building stuff.